I have always believed that Pinwheel is stealing the limelight that Nito deserves. That may sound like heresy to say out loud, as after all, Nito is the first of the dead and one of the original lords, on top of being a figure wrapped in cosmic terror and skeletal grandeur, whereas Pinwheel, by contrast, is often dismissed as one of the weakest and least memorable bosses in the entire Dark Souls franchise. But when you peel back the layers of environmental storytelling, item descriptions, and the actual architecture of the Catacombs and Tomb of the Giants itself, a strange picture begins to emerge. The world beneath Lordran feels less like Nito's dominion and more like Pinwheel's, and that strange imbalance has consequences. Because if the Catacombs belongs to Pinwheel, whether that is through theft or right, if the themes, the motive, and the lived experience of traversing those spaces all scream Pinwheel, then what is left for Nito? The so-called First of the Dead begins to feel hollow and marginalized in his own grave. While it could be likely that From Software did this deliberately, the effect is unmistakable. Pinwheel, the boss that the players barely register, ends up being the one that defines the entire area below Firelink Shrine, whilst Nito becomes an afterthought. When we first learn of Gravelord Nito, it's in the opening cinematic. Gwyn, the Witch of Izalith, the Furative Pygmy, and Nito all discover their Lord Souls within the flame, and together they become the founding four pillars of the entire franchise. Nito's role is to be the primordial bringer of morality, the decomposing Leviathan who ushered in death as we know it. Just as much as he is one of the four lords, he's the fundamental source of death itself in Lordran's cosmology. Death is everywhere in the Age of Fire, not just as an event, but also as a principle, a metaphysical force. His design reinforces this. He's a towering heap of Lovecraftian bones fused into one giant grotesque form. A being that looks less like an individual and more like a collective of death itself. His Covenant, the Gravelord's servants, teases this cosmic power. The Covenant description tells us it's basically about spreading as much misery and death onto other worlds as humanly possible. But in practice, the Covenant barely functions to this standard. Nito feels like a footnote in his own story, and for a Lord Soulbearer, that absence stings. When contrasted with Pinwheel, despite his reputation as an underwhelming encounter, his fingerprints are everywhere in the Catacombs and Tomb of the Giants. Pinwheel is not just a necromancer, he is the pinnacle necromancer. His whole being is defined by the act of stealing power and of merging identities, especially identities of his own family, and of controlling what should be at rest. The Mask of the Father tells us directly. One of the three masks of Pinwheel, the necromancer who stole the power of the Gravelord and reigns over the Catacombs. His other masks, the Mother and the Child, extend this theme. Each carries a buff, but more importantly, each represents a stolen identity claimed by Pinwheel himself. The first belonging to the kindly mother, and the second belonging to the foolish child. Pinwheel is a patchwork being, stitched together from stolen lives, whilst living in the stolen domain from death itself. The game reinforces this claim of ownership through its design. The necromancers who endlessly revive skeletons in the early stages of the Catacombs are what I believe to be Pinwheel's agents and not Nito's. Their use of amputated heads tell me that that is manipulation of death and not the primordial stillness of death that Nito can promise to his followers. The layout of the Catacombs, cluttered reliquaries, trap-laden corridors, and even the idea of using lit candles in a place that should be dark and dingy feels created by a meddler and not the eternal peace granted by the First of the Dead. When we reach Pinwheel himself, that message is hammered home. His chamber is not a cavernous tomb, but instead it is a tomb, most likely forcefully pried open and converted into a study. It's now a ritual hall filled with academic books and a ceremonial table. Pinwheel is a figure of practice, of necromancy as an art, but importantly, necromancy as an obsession. By the time the player cuts him down, we spent a fair amount of time immersed in his design philosophy. Meanwhile, Nito does not carry this same level of weight. In fact, his weight is fairly non-existent, and this is where the problem crystallizes. By making Pinwheel the visible, tactile, thematic custodian of the Catacombs, Nito is left diminished. The very lore of the game insists that Nito is the rightful primordial embodiment of death, yet the game carefully trains the player to associate skeletons, necromancy, and the underworld with Pinwheel. When you finally meet Nito, he has none of Pinwheel's intricate narrative hooks. His boss fight gives us little more than a lumbering giant who carries himself as if he suffers from a metabolic bone disease and some skeleton minions who are not even remotely difficult to deal with. Even his covenant mechanic of the Gravelord's servants, these days it is barely functional, and this leaves his supposed influence over the living world reduced to all but that of a curiosity. What we are left with is a paradox. The first of the dead, a lord who should command ultimate authority over death, ends up feeling like a squatter in his own home. Pinwheel, the quote-unquote joke boss, becomes the one who actually rules death in Lordran, and this waters down Nito's mythology. Because if death in Lordran is now Pinwheel's domain, then Nito becomes effectively redundant. He isn't the author of morality anymore, he's just now another skeleton. That gravitas promised by the opening cinematic never ends up materializing. Of course, you could argue that this was deliberate, and it most likely was. Nito is death personified, and what is death if not silent, passive, and inevitable? His arena reinforces this interpretation. It's dark, and it's a cavern, and it's filled with nothing but bones and decay, and all in all, it's simply just a place where only death can exist. I suppose by contrast, Pinwheel represents the human or inhuman attempt to wrestle with death, to steal its power and to imitate what cannot truly be controlled. If we accept this reading, Pinwheel's reign over the catacombs makes thematic sense. The living meddle and seek to steal that which cannot be stolen, and the dead remain silent as their role pertains. But while this interpretation has poetic weight, it doesn't solve the problem of perception. Amongst many things, Dark Souls is a game of encounters and impressions. Players do not feel Nito's mythic presence. They feel Pinwheel's necromancers, Pinwheel's skeletons, Pinwheel's catacomb. Whether intentional or not, the effect is the same. Nito's role as a Lord Soulbearer feels like a vestige rather than a centerpiece of that area in the game. So, does Pinwheel steal the limelight from Nito? In my own opinion, yes, he absolutely does. The catacombs and the Tomb of the Giants are Pinwheel's kingdom in every practical and thematic sense, in my own subjective opinion. Item descriptions explicitly state that he stole the power of the Gravelord and he reigns over the catacombs. The game design reinforces that theft by embedding Pinwheel in every skeleton and every necromancer and every corner that you see. Meanwhile, Nito, the first of the dead and the Lord of Death itself, slumbers in a cavern waiting to be awakened, offering little more than a boss fight that can be approached with any means. He will go down just as easily with magic as he does pure brute strength. His stature as a lord, promised in the opening moments of the game, collapses under the weight of Pinwheel's pervasive influence. And I suppose that is fitting in its own strange way. Perhaps it is a meta-commentary on death itself, how the concept is monumental, but our lived experience of it is filtered through rituals and humans' attempt to control the only thing that cannot be controlled. But as players, the subjective impression is very clear. Nito should feel like a titan laced in cosmic terror, and instead he feels subjectively underwhelming. Pinwheel, the supposedly weakest boss, ends up defining what it means to walk among the dead in Lordran. However, death is all over Lordran. The blight of Blighttown, the curse of the depths, the vast nothingness of the abyss, the flooding of New Londo ruins, the half-corpses of dragons, and even the hollowing of all of those around us. That is the irony of Dark Souls' approach to death. The first of the dead loses his own grave to a thief, and in that theft, Nito's myth is not only stolen, but cheapened, leaving us to wonder whether the true Gravelord of Lordran was ever Nito at all. Until next time, praise the sun, and don't give up, skeleton.
Don't you dare let yourself go hollow, lest my time spent on you be wasted.